The winds were too sharp. No one could hold the corridor. Talon had pulled out early. The instructors blamed the ridge data. The maneuver was ruled unflyable. From the corner of the hangar, Eleanor unrolled her flight chart. She said nothing. The colonel passed behind her, glanced down and froze. His eyes locked on the tattoo at her neck. Coordinates. A name. Ghost 6. He didn't call a meeting, he just said, "Prep the Apache." She flew it alone. No assist, no deviation. When she landed, the board updated. Ghost 7 active. The colonel never looked away from the telemetry, and never said another word. The sun hit the tarmac like a hammer, flattening every shadow and pressing heat into the seams of concrete and steel. At the edge of the runway, just beyond the sweep of the intake gates, Eleanor stepped down from the transport van and adjusted her flight jacket with a slow, practiced motion. The green fabric had been scrubbed to a soft sheen over years of reissue, and the olive gear at her waist hung with the kind of quiet wear that suggested experience, but not prestige. Her boots were clean, her movements calm. Her name tag read simply, Eleanor. No call sign, no rank, no command ribbons. The airbase buzzed with noise and movement. Personnel in mirrored glasses and crisp uniforms crossed between staging tents, their voices sharp with clipped confidence. Languages overlapped English, French, Portuguese. Pilots from different branches moved in tight clusters, tossing back energy drinks and stretching theatrically in the shade of the aircraft wings. Cameras followed some of them. Briefing tablets pinged with encrypted updates. Today was a joint force evaluation, and everyone was watching. Everyone, except her. Eleanor moved quietly toward the hangar entrance, slipping past a group of NATO techs reviewing the checklist for the Apache training sim. She paused near the mission board, checking the rotation slots. Her name appeared low on the second panel, under the heading Reserve Evaluator, Non-Flying. She nodded once, as if she had expected nothing different, and folded the sleeve of her clipboard back over the edge. She was early. She was always early. Behind her, a voice rose above the hum of the staging ramp. It belonged to a young pilot with immaculate posture and the casual swagger of someone used to winning. His call sign patch was sewn in bold silver Talon. He nudged the man beside him, then tilted his head in Eleanor's direction. "Hey, who's the green jacket with the clipboard? We doing HR optics now." The man beside him didn't look up. Probably a PR attaché. They've been floating them through evaluations. Keeps the footage inclusive. Talon laughed under his breath, then raised his voice just enough. "Maybe she's evaluating our hydration habits, or checking our smiles for the press packet." The group chuckled. None of them approached her. That wasn't necessary. They knew she heard them. That was the point. Eleanor didn't respond. She simply stepped to the side and continued her quiet survey of the space, as if the comment hadn't registered. Her hands were steady, her shoulders relaxed, but the roster had shifted again. She would not be flying. A base logistics officer approached and offered a polite, functional nod. "You're assigned to support logistics, non-combat role. If you could clear the flight ring, we're staging live entries now." She nodded and stepped away. The officer didn't wait to see if she followed. As she crossed the edge of the tarmac, the wind lifted briefly, tugging at her collar. One of the younger techs nearby glanced over and caught a glimpse of the ink on her neck. He squinted, leaned sideways to get a better view, and smirked. "You see that she's got coordinates inked under her ear. What is that where she lost her keys?" Another chuckle. Another voice added, "Maybe it's the location of her influencer handle. Ghost branding." "Right." Talon didn't even look up from his tablet. "Decorative clearance," he said. "Gotta love it." Eleanor touched the collar gently and adjusted it back into place. The gesture was slow, unhurried. She didn't explain. She didn't react. She stepped toward the rear staging zone where support personnel had begun sorting cables and marker cones for the upcoming drill. The breeze died. The voices shifted elsewhere. She stood still for a moment near the edge of a utility trailer, the rubber matting beneath her boots warming fast under the sun. Her eyes moved across the airfield, not to watch the pilots but to mark the wind pattern off the northern ridge. The smoke flags at the far fence twisted slightly off axis. Low crosswind, increasing. She filed it away without comment. Near the front of the staging line, a film crew from the Belgian unit began setting up their camera track. The director, wearing civilian sunglasses and a headset, pointed toward the Apaches and gave brisk instructions about capturing vertical shots at rotation. A few operators struck exaggerated poses beside the simulators, flexing fingers, rolling shoulders, ready for the cut. Eleanor moved back, keeping herself out of frame. A technician from logistics glanced at her badge and pointed toward the gear bins without speaking. She stepped forward and began inspecting the straps. Her hands moved with certainty, but no one noticed. That was fine. She had learned long ago that the quieter you moved, the more people forgot you were there, and the more they forgot, the more you saw. She passed the first cable pack, adjusted a misthreaded tie, and secured the latch without error. No one commented. She reached the rear stowage shelf and double-checked the crate alignment, tightening the rig that someone else had left loose. Across the flight zone, the first helicopter spun up for a dry run, its rotor wash kicking dust in low spirals around the foundation posts. The sound rolled low and wide through the compound. It had weight, not volume. Weight. Eleanor stood up, dusted her gloves once against her thigh, and turned toward the hangar. Her name was still listed on the manifest. It would stay there until the board cleared. A breeze moved again, smaller this time, stirring the collar at her neck for just a moment. She did not adjust it. The ink beneath her skin remained still. North 33 degrees 17.3, east 44 degrees 23.1, ghost 6. She walked back toward the shade of the intake gate. No one called after her. No one asked her name. She didn't expect them to. Not yet. Eleanor's quarters were quiet by design. No decorations, no excess. Just what she needed, and nothing more. A narrow cot pressed against the far wall. A flight locker bolted shut beneath it. One desk with a dim lamp. One folding chair. The only sound was the low pulse of the generator outside and the occasional rustle of wind against the intake filters. It was just past 4 in the morning. The rest of the base was asleep or cycling between shifts. Eleanor sat on the edge of the cot, boots unlaced, a folded chart in her lap. The air in the room was dry, the kind that clung to paper and made every movement soft with static. She unfolded the chart slowly, pressing out the creases where the corners had curled. In the upper margin, next to the faded stamp of a decommissioned training range, a small string of coordinates had been written in black ink: north 33 degrees 17.3, east 44 degrees 23.1. Below that, in slightly neater handwriting, 2 words had been added in capital letters: Ghost 6. The ink had faded, but it hadn't blurred. She traced the numbers lightly with her thumb, not to read them again, but to feel them. That chart had belonged to her father. It had been in his flight kit the day he didn't come back. The story of his crash wasn't printed in any formal report. It was marked only in redacted logs and second-hand memories passed around by those who had flown with him during the test years. He had been part of a classified maneuver program based out of the Eastern Desert Corridor, tasked with training joint forces on extreme envelope rotor techniques. No press, no medals, just skill. He had flown under the name Ghost 6, not a call sign for bravado, a designation used in Black Book briefings quiet, unlisted, known only to the command level and a handful of instructors. When his aircraft went down during a maneuver over unstable ridge wind, there had been no tribute. Just a closed file and a letter delivered with apologies that said very little. Eleanor had been 16. She remembered the exact moment they gave her the box. It was metal, dull gray, and unadorned. Inside it were 3 things: his manual, still creased at the edges, a graphite flight pencil, and a patch with Ghost 6 stitched in clean thread. No emblem. No wing. She hadn't cried. She hadn't spoken. She had taken the patch, placed it beneath the chart on her desk, and turned off the light. That was the last time anyone mentioned his name to her aloud. After that, she trained alone. It had started before the crash. Really. He had brought her into the cockpit when she was barely tall enough to reach the pedals. Not for joyrides, but for systems checks. She learned engine staging before she could drive. He taught her how to listen to torque through the vibration in the seat, how to trim pitch without chasing the line, how to log wind patterns by watching dust shift across the tarmac. He used chalk on the side of the hangar wall to diagram lift vectors and maneuver shadows. He made her recreate every move from memory, then test it blindfolded on the simulator. There was no encouragement, no praise, just trust. When she got it right, he moved on to the next. By the time she reached enlistment age, Eleanor had more simulator hours than most second-year cadets. But her name was never pushed forward. She didn't come from an academy pipeline. Her father's records were sealed. She entered under general contract as a systems specialist, never flagged for direct command training. That changed briefly during a base consolidation year. A forward pilot evaluator recognized her from a closed-room control test. He asked for her record. She ran 2 full sim rotations and passed at 100.0 accuracy. She was assigned a flight track. It lasted 8 months. Then, a quiet memo came through stating that optics around instructor legacy integration had become a concern. Her clearance was downgraded, her path redirected to reserve evaluator with logistical privileges. The reason was never made explicit. She didn't protest. She signed the reassignment papers, thanked the board, and returned to the training hangar the next morning before sunrise. She was never late, never loud, never out of uniform. The tattoo had come not long after. She had inked it herself, with the help of an off-grid artist who had flown out of a mountain strip in the north. The coordinates were precise. The numbers marked the crash site, now overgrown, unmapped, ignored. Ghost 6. That was what they called him when they didn't want to say his real name. She placed it just under her left ear, high on the neck, not for display, but for memory. If it ever showed, so be it. She wasn't hiding it, but she wasn't offering it either. She looked up from the chart now, eyes scanning the locker. Taped to the inside of the metal door was a faded maneuver graph, her father's final training overlay. It showed a tactical drop hover inside a low-visibility wind corridor, with a correction pattern that had never been finalized. He had been developing it when he died. Most said the move was unflyable. The parameters were too tight, the corridor too shallow. But Eleanor had been studying it ever since. She had recreated the sequence across 17 different sim platforms, adjusted for elevation, for drag, for angle shift in crosswind. She'd never flown it in full, not yet, but she knew it. Down to the 3rd decimal, down to the exact angle of pitch hold required to stabilize at the end. This wasn't nostalgia, this was blueprint memory. She folded the chart carefully and placed it back into its sleeve. The desk lamp flickered once as the generator cycled. She didn't flinch. In the stillness, she reached down and unzipped a side pouch. Inside, among her regulation gear, was the patch from the metal box. She hadn't worn it in years. It had no place in her current file. But the thread was still strong, the name still legible. She slid the patch back into place inside the pouch and zipped it shut. She wasn't trying to be remembered. She was trying to be ready. Outside, a shift bell rang through the concrete. Morning rotations would begin soon. Eleanor stood, fastened the collar of her flight jacket, and rolled her shoulders once. The weight was the same, but the center of gravity was hers now. The prep room smelled like ozone and disinfectant, the kind of clean that came from too much effort, like someone was trying to scrub the air itself. Panels of touchscreens lined the walls, each lit with blue telemetry grids. The sim floor had already been activated, but the main sequence wouldn't start for another 20 minutes. Eleanor arrived before the crowd, as always, her steps quiet against the tile, clipboard tucked under one arm, a slim flight graph folded in her other hand. She moved to the far table, the one without chairs, and laid the graph down gently. The pattern showed a corrected drop arc for rotor instability under wind shear. The axis pitch was marked with red pencil. She leaned closer, reviewing her own annotations, checking for margin shift. No one greeted her. No one asked why she was there. The instructor team entered in a wave of sound and confidence, boots louder than necessary, laughter high. A few of them paused near the entry board, scanning the schedule. Talon's name stood top right, bracketed with blue. Eleanor's was missing, not moved, just not there. The lead instructor, a broad-shouldered man with a pilot's tan and a clipped tone, walked past her without making eye contact. Then he stopped, turned back halfway, and nodded toward her badge. "You're on safety protocol observation only. Observers wait outside the ops ring. We've got press in the gallery." Eleanor nodded. She didn't move yet. She had 3 notes left to review. He waited a moment longer, then turned back to the group. Talon was already mid-joke by the time she gathered her folder. He leaned on one elbow near the main sim panel, arms crossed, aviator glasses hooked into the front of his vest. His voice carried just far enough. "Is she here for PR footage or just morale boost? We got a recruiting poster coming in later." Someone else snorted. "Nah. They send them in to keep our testosterone down. Safety protocols." More laughter. Eleanor didn't turn. She folded her flight graph, closed her clipboard, and stepped away from the console. The temperature had started to rise in the room. The sim system always ran hot in the first cycle, and someone had already removed one of the wall fans to mount a drone camera. The heat stirred her collar slightly. A breeze passed from the vent, shifting the edge of her flight jacket just enough to reveal the curve of ink on her neck. A younger pilot near the rear wall tilted his head. "Nice branding. What is that grid coordinates to her influencer profile?" Talon grinned. "No. Man, it's her brand. Ghost 6. You know, sounds edgy. Like a perfume line for veterans." Another round of laughter. No one told them to stop. Eleanor adjusted her collar without rush. The fabric moved softly back into place. She said nothing. A single pilot, standing near the far panel, glanced at her folded flight graph. His gaze lingered. Then he looked away. He didn't speak. The sim sequence loaded. A schematic of the flight corridor appeared on the wall. The evaluation parameters were drawn from a NATO Ridge Pass scenario tight drop entry with 2 wind bursts and 1 thermal inversion at the midpoint. The rating curve was high. Most pilots scored in the low 80s. Talon stepped forward with the casual confidence of someone already drafting his post-flight soundbite. The door behind Eleanor buzzed open. A technician handed her a diagnostic tag and gestured for her to clear the floor. She moved toward the observation ring, stepping behind the line without protest. The heat followed her. Talon entered the simulator and adjusted the seat without reading the overlay. He laughed again, loud enough to carry. "I'll try to keep it boring," he said. "Don't want to overshadow the real stars in the back row." The sim began. Within 2 minutes, he was off pace. His yaw correction was late. He oversteered the corridor edge and clipped the thermal pocket too early. The aircraft graphics shuddered on the screen. He recovered with a dramatic overcorrection that earned nods from a few of the instructors, but quietly dropped his performance index below 79. Eleanor made one notation on her clipboard, not the error, the timing. Talon hit the final vector. He came in high, then stalled the maneuver and forced a manual override on descent. The room clapped lightly anyway. A technician gave a thumbs up. The system rated it passable. Talon stepped out of the simulator and pointed directly at Eleanor. "Your note-taking's probably throwing off the sensor sync. That why I missed Corridor 2. She didn't respond. "Next time just stand in the hallway. Don't want your spreadsheets interfering with greatness." The instructor beside him chuckled. "Talon, be nice. She's doing her best." More snickering. Eleanor stood still, her clipboard tucked neatly against her ribs. A supervisor walked past her without stopping. "You can wait outside," he said. "We're locking the floor for priority clearance." She nodded once. Moved to the exit. The door hissed open with a burst of cooler air. Outside, the hallway was empty. The glass wall offered a clear view of the sim bay. Inside, Talon was shaking hands with the press crew. Someone adjusted his collar for the camera. Another tech angled a second screen to show the corridor map, as if the score didn't matter. The heat hadn't left the room. It just lingered now behind the walls. Eleanor stood by the observation rail, her hands at her sides. The clipboard rested against her hip. She did not speak. She did not shift her weight. She watched the playback with steady eyes. The final corridor alignment was nearly 1 full second late. That error would cost a crew their hover time in live terrain. No one mentioned it. She wrote it down anyway. The flight graph in her folder was folded and clean, the paper worn but precise. She hadn't shown it to anyone. She didn't need to. It wasn't for them. Inside the sim room, Talon laughed again. Then he glanced toward the door. Eleanor was gone. The hangar operations room was nearly empty, lit by the glow of a single halogen panel above the drafting table. Everything else was dim. The rest of the team had gone to evening chow or drifted back toward the barracks. Eleanor stayed behind, seated on a metal stool, with her sleeves pushed to her elbows and her hands steady over a wide grid of flight maps and printed telemetry sheets. Her pencil moved slowly along the spine of a hand-drawn path she'd traced and retraced dozens of times. The inked layers showed descent velocity, wind shear tolerance, yaw pressure gradients, all built around one impossible curve. She had laid it over her father's final flight archive, the original telemetry data classified, but incomplete, had been downloaded in pieces over the years, reconstructed from fragments that nobody else bothered to preserve. It had taken her nearly a decade to understand the missing parts, but she did. The pattern he had tried to fly wasn't a mistake. It was just unfinished. She was finishing it now. Behind her, the outer door opened without fanfare. The room's air shifted slightly. She didn't look up until she heard the pause, the kind of silence that only followed recognition. The colonel stood just inside the threshold, one hand still on the doorframe. He didn't speak. Not yet. Eleanor turned slightly, straightening from her work. Her jacket had slipped off one shoulder during the last hour of adjustments, exposing the edge of the ink on her neck. She made no move to cover it. His gaze fixed on the tattoo, not with curiosity, but with slow, dawning calculation. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the coordinates etched just beneath her ear. "Where did you get those numbers?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, just clear. She didn't blink. "They're a site," she said, "and a name." He stopped at the table, scanning the flight maps, the notes layered in pencil and pen. Then he looked back at her face. "Ghost 6, he said, as if testing the words against memory. "You're his daughter." She nodded once. "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned over the table. The lines of the overlay came into view: ridge descent, thermal rebound, a correction line angled across a negative drag pocket. It was a maneuver few on base could even read, let alone fly. "This is his pattern," he said slowly. "The one he was working when it happened." "It's the same terrain," she said. "Same drop sequence. But I corrected the hover throttle window and widened the wind tolerance by 3 degrees. Stabilizer drift under weight is neutral now. It flies." He stared at the path for several long seconds. His hand rested near the corner of the chart. Then, without lifting his gaze, he asked, "You've tested it?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Sim data for over a year. And I've run it manual on partial lift tracks. Real terrain, real elevation, shadowed fuel load." The colonel stepped back. His shoulders rose and fell with a single breath. Then he turned toward the doorway. "Prep the aircraft," he said. A technician who had just entered the hall froze. "Sir." "She flies," the colonel said. "Live clearance, now." There was no argument in his voice, no debate, just truth landing hard. The tech hesitated again. "Sir, she's not on the board. Her ID." "I said prep the aircraft," the colonel repeated. He turned back to the table and looked at Eleanor. "Load her overlay. No assist. Full diagnostics. Give her wind telemetry from today, and drop the pre-cleared protocols." The room had gone still. Another ops lead appeared from the hall, and someone else behind him. Voices dropped low. Orders began to pass between them in clipped tones, quiet and urgent. Eleanor rolled up the map with clean hands and locked the pencil inside the case. She didn't smile, didn't thank him. She simply nodded and stepped around the table toward the hangar exit. The colonel followed her with his eyes. "The Apache on Pad 3 is tuned for real correction," he said. "That's the one we buried the project with." "I know," she said. He paused. "You're flying the same drop corridor your father died in." "Yes," she said, "but I'm not flying it to honor him. I'm flying it because it works." He watched her go. The board in the control tower hadn't updated yet. There was no call sign, no active pilot listed, just a blank row on the manifest, tagged with a line of code no one recognized. Ghost protocol. Activated. The air outside the hangar had cooled, but not by much. The desert ridge held onto heat long after sunset. Eleanor stood alone beside the Apache on Pad 3, helmet under one arm, flight gloves already on. The pre-flight crew had finished their checks and backed away in a half circle, watching her with the kind of silence that suggested they weren't sure what they were looking at. Some of them had never seen her in a flight suit. Fewer still had known she was rated to fly at all. She zipped her collar to the top and stepped onto the loading step without hesitation. The Apache crouched slightly under her weight as she entered the cockpit. No one said anything through comms. They just listened. Inside the canopy, the controls were already live. She moved through each sequence by hand: fuel gate, nav sync, rotor torque readouts. Her fingers moved with ease. Not fast, not flashy, just precise. The system didn't need coaxing. It responded to her touch, like it had been waiting. She adjusted the seat by exactly 2 notches and reached for the shoulder straps. The buckle clicked into place with finality. Outside, the tower issued clearance. She acknowledged with a single word. No sign-offs, no banter. As the rotors began to spin, the pressure in the cockpit changed. Eleanor felt the shift before the aircraft lifted. Her breath settled into a rhythm. 1 inhale on lift, 1 exhale on stabilizer lock. The aircraft rose smoothly from the pad, blades cutting through the air with perfect separation. The tower watched through high-gain cameras. Inside the control booth, every console had a telemetry feed open. The colonel stood at the back, arms crossed. The climb to altitude was uneventful. She held steady on her vertical line, then curved gently east toward the edge of the ridge. The approach corridor ahead narrowed quickly, natural rock funneling wind into unstable patterns. The same location her father had entered 15 years earlier. The same direction, the same wind signature. She didn't blink. She cut speed deliberately. Wind shear touched the left stabilizer, but she corrected without overcompensating. The nose dipped on cue, and the slope appeared below angled and uneven, with loose thermals rising in chaotic bursts. It was the kind of terrain that taught arrogance a fast lesson. But Eleanor didn't fly with noise. She flew with numbers. The ghost drop began at 200 meters. She marked it with a single internal count. The aircraft pitched forward into the descent, blades shifting pitch as she pulled into negative drift. The draft caught the left side, just as she had calculated. She held the line, resisting the instinct to steer out of the pocket. Her father had done that, just before the telemetry cut. She kept straight. At 120 meters, the thermal reverse struck. A weaker pilot would have been thrown out of rhythm. She adjusted thrust 3% and rotated the nose 4 degrees, bringing the Apache into a hover not by force, but by balance. The rotors evened out in the crosswind like she had planned. There was no sound in her ears, no voices. The tower had gone completely silent. She held the hover for 1 breath. Then she pushed forward again, sliding laterally with just enough lift to clear the outcropping that had ended her father's flight. The aircraft flexed. She kept it aligned. The extraction vector was short, only 60 meters of window left before the canyon turned vertical. She didn't hesitate. The thrust angle was already adjusted. She engaged with no overcompensation, rising in a smooth arc that cleared the final rock point by 8 meters. She brought the Apache into open air, leveled off, and let the aircraft stabilize on a return heading. Inside the tower, No one moved. Eleanor keyed the final sequence and activated return clearance. Her voice was calm. One completed, vector clear, systems nominal. The colonel stepped forward. His eyes never left the screen. The telemetry line was flawless. Speed sync, drop point, recovery altitude. All values had landed within margin. The system posted the final score. 100.0. No one clapped. No one spoke. The air was too still for performance. Eleanor brought the Apache back to the pad and landed without external guidance. The skids touched down like they had never left. She powered down the rotors slowly, letting the engine ease into silence. When the canopy opened, the heat came back into the cabin. She unbuckled, stepped down onto the tarmac, and removed her helmet. Her hands were steady. A few techs stood nearby, not speaking. Someone in a flight vest reached for a clipboard, then stopped. No words were exchanged. The colonel walked out onto the pad. He didn't bring a crew, just a folded paper in his hand. He looked at the Apache, then at Eleanor. "That's the first clean execution of that pattern in recorded history," he said. She nodded once. "I didn't clean it. I completed it." He held out the paper. "Final telemetry," he said. "Full clearance signed. Call sign logged." She took it without looking at the numbers. She already knew what it would say. He studied her for another second. "Your father didn't fail. He was first. You brought it home." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Behind them, the aircraft settled into its stillness. Wind passed across the ridge without resistance. The board in the tower updated silently. A new name blinked onto the manifest. Ghost 7, active. The flight pad was quiet now. The Apache sat still beneath the fading orange light, blades gently ticking as they cooled. Heat lifted in soft waves off the tarmac. Most of the personnel had returned to their quarters or filtered out to the debrief trailers, leaving only the sound of distant air units and the hum of generator fans carrying across the hardpan. Eleanor moved slowly across the concrete, her helmet in one hand, her gloves looped through the other. The zipper on her flight jacket was half open, collar soft around her neck. Dust clung to her sleeves. Her boots left clean marks with every step, then vanished behind her in the shifting wind. She didn't head to the control tower. She didn't check the board. She didn't speak to anyone. Instead, she walked to the bench behind the hangar, where the maintenance crew usually kept their toolkits during breaks. She sat without ceremony, pulled a small cloth from her thigh pocket, and began to wipe down the gloves. The leather was warm from use. Her hands didn't tremble. The sounds around her dulled with distance. A wheeled cart rattled once, then faded. A bird called somewhere overhead. The evening didn't pause for her, and she didn't ask it to. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hangar, measured and slow. She didn't look up until the colonel stopped just short of the bench. He held a small envelope in his left hand, sealed and creased at one corner. She stood, steady and wordless. He extended the envelope without explanation. She took it and opened it slowly. Inside was a patch, faded, worn, but unmistakable. The black stitching still held strong. Ghost 6. No symbols, no unit name, just the name. Below it sat a single clearance card with her photograph clipped into the upper corner. The text at the bottom read, Ghost 7 active. Neither of them spoke right away. Finally, the colonel said, "You flew it clean." Eleanor nodded once. It wasn't for them. He held her gaze. It was for him. She didn't smile. She folded the envelope and tucked it into her side pocket with the same quiet care she had given every other step of the day. He didn't salute. He didn't shake her hand. He turned and walked away with the same unspoken finality with which he had delivered the order to fly. She watched him go. Then she sat back down and finished cleaning the gloves. The light shifted. The horizon darkened. Someone in the tower reset the display. A soft mechanical click echoed faintly as the new manifest registered. Ghost 7 active. No announcement followed. No call over the comms. Just a subtle change in the system. A line where before there had been nothing. Those who noticed didn't ask. Those who understood said nothing. Eleanor stood again and ran her fingers down the edge of the bench, then stepped off the platform and walked toward the far end of the pad. The Apache sat behind her, motionless, dark against the night. It had flown the same path her father hadn't returned from, and now it waited, no longer haunted. She didn't look back at it. Her pace didn't change as she passed the last row of parked equipment. A wind carried faint grit across the ground, brushing past her boots, slipping under her cuffs. She walked with her head level, eyes forward, posture relaxed. No lights followed her, no cameras, no applause. The hangar behind her disappeared into shadow. Eleanor reached the edge of the tarmac where the painted lines broke into open gravel, then paused. She adjusted the collar of her jacket once. She slid the gloves into the front pocket. And then she continued, her steps measured, her body at ease. She had not been cleared for show. She had not been asked for proof. She had been trusted to carry what no one else could. And now she would carry it forward, quietly, precisely, just as it was meant to be. Eleanor was never loud. She never asked for recognition or fought to be seen. But she showed up, every day, carrying the weight of a legacy the world had quietly buried. Through dismissal, silence, and doubt, she held her ground not to prove something, but because she already knew her worth. And when the moment finally came, she didn't rise to meet it. She had been ready all along. This is the story of quiet strength, of legacy honored not through words, but through action. A reminder that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply arrives, calm and steady. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the strength of those who lead without needing applause, follow along for more stories that speak softly, but leave something lasting behind.